Chris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War, and I'm standing on the Monocacy battlefield just south of Frederick, Maryland. The Battle of Monocacy took place in July of 1864 after Jubal Early had been making his way down the Shenandoah Valley and began to threaten Washington, D.C. Lew Wallace, the federal commander who had been banished to Baltimore following his mishaps at the Battle of Shiloh, is suddenly charged with first trying to protect the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and some of the commercial interests that were threatened. The railroad folks got really upset and nervous about. But then as Early's move toward Washington became a bit more apparent, Wallace is charged with cobbling together a force, trying to intercept him, and he's able to pull together a force on the far side of the river here to try to stop Jubal Early. Jubal Early's men do get here. They occupy the north bank of the river. They get around Wallace's flank, drive the Federals off the field, and then continue on their march toward Washington, D.C. So it's a small battle, but it's known as the battle that saved Washington because that one-day delay, even though Jubal Early won the battle, that delay is going to mean that he's going to lose the campaign because by the time he gets to Washington, D.C., federal reinforcements have been shifted up from around Richmond and Petersburg so that they can occupy the defenses around Washington, D.C. Washington's the most fortified city in the world at that point. But those fortifications don't mean a thing if they're not properly defended. And by that point of the war, they were not, because Grant had stripped a lot of the defenders away to join his army as it had moved across the center of Virginia down toward Richmond and then into the sieges around Petersburg. And so he has to shift reinforcements back up to D.C. in order for those fortifications to be effective again. So Early gets there to Fort Stevens, finds himself unable to break through, and he's going to pull back, and that's really going to end the campaign for him. But there are other implications to this battle as well that I'd like you to consider. First of all, not only does Washington get saved as a result, but let's think about what happens as a result of that. Jubal Early, who I would argue is one of the most hardened, effective defenders of the Confederacy in the entire course of the war. I mean, it's true on the battlefield, but it's particularly true afterwards because he's one of the leading architects of the lost cause. As one of the men responsible for curating and keeping the flame lit for that story afterwards, how does that affect our memory of this battle? As the guy who's really charged with Confederate memory, takes it upon himself to be in charge of Confederate memory, how does that then affect the way we remember this battlefield victory and campaign loss for him? So that's one thing to think about. I also consider, like, as a result of the move on Fort Stevens, it finally convinces Grant that he probably ought to do something about Early after all. It's sort of been kind of brushing him aside. So he's going to then send Phil Sheridan out here to the Valley, and that's going to lead to the 64 Valley Campaign in the fall, which is ultimately going to help seal Lincoln's re-election when Sheridan helps see the victory there at Cedar Creek. That's also then going to lead to the rise of Phil Sheridan as General-in-Chief of the Army. So all of those are sort of ripples that result from this particular battle. So think about the wide implications of what happens on these fields around me. On the federal side, think about Lew Wallace, who was in disgrace because of Shiloh. He's again pilloried because of the loss here, at least in the immediate after effect. But then as people realize what happened, what those after effects were, what Wallace did with what he had to work with, it actually goes to redeem his reputation. Wallace will spend his whole post-war career trying to get redemption from Ulysses S. Grant, who will put a note in his memoirs partially exonerating Wallace for quote-unquote getting lost out at Shiloh, which Wallace contends he never did. He'll never get the full exoneration from Grant that he hoped for, but they did reconcile in Grant's, literally in Grant's last year, and Grant did put something in his memoirs that talks about new evidence that has come to light since his first assessment of that action. Of course, Wallace will then also write Ben-Hur, which would be the best-selling novel of the century. So he doesn't make out too bad for himself. But this great little battle just has fantastic repercussions. I'd urge you to read more about it. My colleague Ryan Quint has a book in the Emerging Civil War series called Determined to Stand and Fight. I had a great day out on this field with him as we were taking pictures for that book. It's a great battlefield to explore, a great battlefield to read about, and a great battlefield that helps broaden your understanding of the late war in 1864. For Emerging Civil War, I'm Chris Mackowski. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.